The gate should have been locked. Myra Thorne knew that the way she knew the sound of ice forming on the pine branches above her roof, not by sight, not by logic, but by something older, by the body's quiet understanding of when the world has shifted half a degree in the wrong direction. It was 3 in the morning in the Rogue River Valley, and something outside was bleeding sound into the dark. Before we go any further, think about this. A woman alone in the mountains, a horse with no rider, a camera that should not exist, and men with rifles standing in the fog before sunrise. Here is what I want to know from you. If you found something that could destroy the people who destroyed your life, would you be brave enough to use it? Or would you bury it to save yourself? Drop your city in the comments right now. Tell me what you would do. And if this story grabs you in the first 5 minutes, because I promise you, it will, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this is the kind of story that does not let go. Now, back to the valley. The Rogue River Valley kept its own clock. In summer it was generous, its light falling long and amber through the ponderosa pines, the river running cold and clear over granite the color of old bone. But by November it became something else entirely. The light retreated before 4 in the afternoon. The fog came off the water before dinner, and by midnight the valley had sealed itself shut like a jar pressed tight against the world outside. Myra Thorne had lived inside that sealed world for 11 years, and in the last 3 she had learned to be grateful for it. The Thorne property sat at the end of a gravel road that connected to the county route through 2 miles of Sitka spruce and Douglas fir so dense that even in July the road stayed dark by midday. The main house was a structure of dark timber and river stone, built in 1908 by a man who had believed in permanence. Double-hung windows, a wraparound porch, roof beams cut from old growth that would outlast everyone who ever stood beneath them. There were 14 acres in total, a creek that ran through the eastern pasture, a barn that could hold 8 horses though it currently held none, and a root cellar that had been converted, over many careful years, into a darkroom. That last detail was Myra's alone. Everything else had been theirs. She was 54 years old, and she looked every year of it, not in a diminished way, but in the way that certain landscapes look better worn, the kind of face that had been through weather and come out on the other side with structure intact. Gray had moved through her dark hair like a slow tide, starting at the temples when she was 46 and now reaching almost everywhere. She kept it pulled back when she worked and loose when she slept, which was rarely and badly. Her hands told the clearest story. 20 years of forensic photography had left them permanently precise. The kind of hands that never reached for anything carelessly, that framed the world in invisible rectangles before touching it. She had spent 2 decades photographing crime scenes for the Oregon State Police. Bodies in shallow water, evidence scattered in the mud of logging roads, the intimate wreckage of lives ended too soon. She had learned to see without flinching. She had learned to separate the thing she was looking at from the feeling the thing produced. The feeling always came later, at home, in the dark. She had retired 3 years ago, officially citing fatigue. The actual reason was that she could no longer separate looking from feeling, and she was afraid of what that collapse meant. The property had been in her husband's family. Daniel Thorne had inherited it from an uncle who preferred cities, and he and Myra had spent the first 8 years of their marriage driving up from Portland on long weekends, fixing what broke, painting what faded, planting a kitchen garden that the deer destroyed with magnificent consistency every spring. They were happy there in the way that people are happy when the happiness is not yet tested. Daniel was a journalist, not the television kind, not the kind that chased celebrity and disaster on a news cycle. The other kind, the increasingly rare kind who spent 8 months on a single story, who drove to remote counties and sat in diners and earned trust slowly. He had broken 2 federal corruption stories in his career, won a regional press award for a series on pesticide contamination in the Willamette Valley, and had been working on something new when he disappeared. He had told Myra it was big. He had said it the way he said everything important, quietly, with his eyes doing most of the work. He had said, "There are people in this valley who believe they own it, not the land, the people." And then he had driven north into the fog with his camera bag and his notebook and his thermos of black coffee, and he had not come back. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department had investigated for 6 weeks. They had found his truck parked on a logging road above the river. They had found boot prints leading into the tree line and no boot prints leading out. They had interviewed the people he had recently spoken with and come back with nothing they were willing to say out loud. After 6 weeks, the lead investigator, A man named Sterling Vance, who had recently been appointed county inspector, had told Myra, with his hat in his hands and no particular emotion in his eyes, that the evidence suggested voluntary disappearance. Myra had looked at him for a long time without speaking. She knew what voluntary disappearance evidence looked like. She had photographed it. She knew it did not look like a man who left without his insulin kit, without his external hard drive, without the photograph of Myra he kept on his desk that he had told her, once, was the first thing he looked for when he came home from anywhere. She had not said any of this to Sterling Vance. She had thanked him politely, closed the door, and driven home to the Rogue River property, where she had stayed ever since. 3 years of mornings in the kitchen, coffee going cold while she stared at the tree line. 3 years of walking the fence perimeter at dusk, listening. 3 years of keeping the darkroom stocked and locked, because the last rolls of film Daniel had sent her, 3 canisters dropped in the mail from a town 40 miles north, with a note that said, just in case, had never yielded anything useful when she developed them. Overexposed, underexposed, or blank. She had spent 2 weeks convinced she was doing something wrong before accepting that whatever Daniel had been trying to preserve, either the chemistry or the cosmos had decided otherwise. She still had the negatives. She kept them in a fireproof box under her bed and thought about them every night before she slept and every morning when she woke, and most of the hours in between. The property ran on a small subsidy from the Oregon Historic Preservation Fund, which covered basic maintenance costs in exchange for Myra keeping the main house open for quarterly historical society tours. The rest she managed on her retirement pension, which had been sufficient until the county reassessed property taxes 2 years ago and increased her rate by 40%. She was now 8 months behind on the mortgage she had taken out to repair the barn roof after a winter storm. The bank had been patient. The bank's patience had a number attached to it, and that number had an expiration date that was approaching. She had not told anyone about the mortgage. She had no one close enough to tell. November 14th began like every other night in the valley that month. Fog by 9, temperature dropping to 28 by midnight, the creek making its low cold sound in the darkness to the east, the pines moving in a wind she could feel but not quite hear. She went to bed at 10:30 with a book she was not reading. She was asleep by 11. At 3:12 in the morning, something struck the main gate. The sound was not subtle. It was iron on iron, the heavy swing latch of the entrance gate striking its post in a rhythm that was not the rhythm of wind. Wind moved in patterns she knew. This was not a pattern. This was desperation. Myra was out of bed before she was fully awake. Her body, already making decisions her mind was still catching up to. Boots by the door, flannel jacket over her sleep shirt, the tactical flashlight from the drawer of the bedside table, a habit from 20 years of crime scene work, always a light within reach. She did not own a firearm. She had considered it, after Daniel, but she knew enough about the physics of fear and firearms to know that her judgment under pressure was not what it had been. She had other kinds of tools. The porch boards were cold through the thin soles of her boots. The fog had settled thick and low, and the beam of her flashlight caught it and turned it white, a corridor of illuminated nothing extending maybe 15 feet before the world gave up. She stood still for a moment on the porch steps, listening. The gate struck again, once hard, and then she heard it, underneath the iron sound, underneath the fog, the sound of a horse in distress. Not a whinny, not the clean, bright vocalization of an animal calling to another. This was lower, a series of rapid exhalations, almost percussive, the sound of a large animal that had been running for a long time and had arrived somewhere and was not sure the arriving was safe. She walked down the gravel path to the gate. The flashlight found it before she did, a shape in the fog, tall and restless, moving back and forth in a 2-foot arc the way horses move when they want to go somewhere, but cannot determine which direction that somewhere is. Gray. A gray horse, almost white in the flashlight's beam, its coat darkened in irregular patches by what she initially thought was sweat, but quickly understood was mud. The dark red mud of the valley's deeper forest floors, the kind that only occurred in the creek hollows well above the road line. It had been running through the backcountry, long and hard, and without rest, by the look of it. She reached the gate and stopped. The horse stopped too. It turned toward the light and regarded her with one enormous dark eye, its breath coming in visible clouds that joined the fog and disappeared. It was a Lusitano. She could see that even in the dark, even in this state, the breed had a particular quality to the head, a dish to the face, a forward set of the ears that was distinctive. It was a horse that cost more than most people's cars, and it was standing alone in the middle of the night on a logging road in the Rogue River Valley, and the saddle on its back, a dark leather western saddle, high quality, the kind of thing you bought once and kept for 20 years, had something attached to it that the flashlight was just beginning to resolve. Myra stood with her hand on the gate latch and did not move. The horse shivered, not from cold, from something anterior to cold. The way animals shiver when they have been close to something that frightened them at a cellular level, in the place before language where the body simply responds. She opened the gate. She opened it slowly, pressing it back along the gravel, keeping her movements smooth and her breathing audible, because horses responded to breath the way people responded to tone, not the content, but the quality. She was calm. She pushed the calm out through her exhales and let it fill the space between her and the animal. The horse did not move for a long moment. Then it walked through the gate. It walked past her close enough that she could feel the heat coming off its flank, close enough to smell the forest on it. Wet pine, creek mud, something else underneath that she could not immediately name, but that made the hair on her forearms rise before she understood why. It walked through the gate and stopped in the middle of the gravel path and stood, trembling finely, its head dropping with exhaustion. She pulled the gate shut behind it and turned the flashlight on the saddle. It was attached to the left saddle ring by a carabiner clip, a small nylon bag, the kind used for trail photography, fitted with a hard plastic shell to protect its contents. The shell was cracked on one side, but inside, she could see the outline of a camera body, and mounted to the camera body, a lens. A specific lens. A 50mm prime with a dent on the barrel hood that she recognized the way she would have recognized Daniel's handwriting on an envelope. Immediately, completely, without requiring confirmation from any other part of her mind. She had put that dent in the lens herself, 7 years ago, bumping it against a granite countertop in a rented cabin in eastern Washington. She had felt terrible about it. Daniel had said it was fine, that the glass was intact, that character was different from damage. She had not thought about that moment in 3 years. She stood in the dark with her flashlight on the lens and did not breathe for what felt like a long time. The horse stood beside her and shivered and waited. She did not take the camera off the saddle. Not yet. She led the horse to the barn instead, moving on autopilot, her body understanding that the animal needed water and shelter before she needed answers. She filled a bucket from the outdoor tap and found a bag of oats in the barn storage and put the horse in the large center stall with both. And then she sat down on a hay bale and looked at the camera for a very long time. It was not Daniel's camera. It could not be. Strictly speaking, Daniel's camera had disappeared with him. But the lens was his. The same dent, the same position on the barrel hood, the same small scratch on the filter ring she had never noticed until this moment because she had not been looking for it before. Someone had taken Daniel's lens and mounted it to a different body. Or someone had taken Daniel's entire kit and swapped out the body. Inside the camera bag, just visible through the cracked shell, was the rewind knob of a 35mm film body. And the film counter window, barely legible in the flashlight's beam, showed a number. 24. 24 frames exposed. Her heart beat once, very hard, and then settled into something controlled and deliberate. She did not touch the camera. She covered the horse with a spare blanket she found on a hook by the barn door, and she walked back to the house, and she did not sleep again. She sat in the kitchen and watched the tree line through the east window and waited for whatever was coming. Dawn came in stages. First, the blackness developed texture, the pines resolving out of the dark the way images resolved in developer solution, detail arriving slowly, and then all at once. Then color returned, gray first, then the pale yellow of frost on the grass, then the deeper green of the trees. The fog off the creek moved low across the pasture in long horizontal sheets, turning the east field into something that looked like a painting of itself rather than the actual place. Myra stood at the kitchen sink with her second cup of coffee and watched it happen. She had done this thousands of times. She knew exactly what the light looked like at 6:15 in November, what angle the first sun would hit the barn roof, how long before the frost burned off the fence posts along the south pasture. She did not know what headlights looked like on the logging road at this hour, because there had never been headlights on the logging road at this hour. There were headlights on the logging road. Not one set. Multiple. The fog diffused them into something ambient and sourceless at first, just a brightening in the wrong direction, a luminescence that had no business being northwest of the property at 6:20 in the morning. She set her coffee down without thinking about it and moved to the window over the sink, pressing close to the glass. 3 sets of headlights on the logging road. Now 4. Moving slowly, in convoy formation, the way vehicles moved when they were being deliberate rather than traveling. Black trucks. She could not see the color clearly yet, but the shape was unmistakable even in the fog. The high roofline, the wide stance of heavy-duty pickups, the kind of vehicles that the Rogue River hunting crowd drove during season and parked outside the Cascade Bar on weekends. Except season had ended 2 weeks ago. She counted the vehicles as they turned onto her property access road. 6 black trucks moving in single file down the 2-mile gravel road that led to her gate. She did not move from the window. The truck slowed as they reached the main gate, and in the growing light she could see that the gate was, of course, closed. She had closed it after bringing the horse in. She watched as a door opened on the lead truck and a figure stepped out. He stood in front of the gate for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. He looked at the gate. He looked at the house. Then he reached up and pressed the intercom button that Myra had installed 2 years ago, mostly to avoid walking to the gate in the rain when the Historical Society representatives came for their quarterly visits. The intercom crackled. She crossed to it without hurrying. The voice on the other end was familiar. Not warmly familiar. The kind of familiar that sits in the back of the throat like a swallowed thing. Sterling Vance said, "Good morning, Mrs. Thorne. We need to talk." She pressed the button. She said, "Inspector." She could hear him breathing on the other end. A man of patience. That was how she had always read him. The kind of patience that was actually a form of contempt, a certainty that he had time to spare because the outcome was already settled. He said, "Come out to the porch, please." Alone. She put on her coat and her boots. She walked to the porch. She stood at the top of the steps with her hands in her pockets and watched Sterling Vance walk from the gate to the foot of her porch stairs. He looked exactly as he had 3 years ago, which was itself a kind of offense. The same press shirt under an open canvas jacket, the same weathered hat, the same jaw that sat slightly forward as if accustomed to heading into wind. He was 61 years old, and he looked built for this landscape in a way that felt like a warning. Behind him, the 6 trucks had parked in a line along the fence. The doors were opening. Men were getting out. She counted. 11 men, each one carrying a rifle. Not handguns, rifles. Long guns broken over forearms in the careful carry of men who knew how to use them and were being deliberate about showing that they knew. Vance reached the bottom of the steps and stopped. He looked up at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "We're looking for an animal. Gray Lusitano, registered to a member of the Rogue River Hunting Association. It wandered off a scene last night. You haven't happened to see it, have you?" She said, "What kind of scene?" "A hunting scene," he said. The word hunting smooth and practiced. "We had an incident with a wounded elk above the Whiskey Creek drainage. The animal spooked during the recovery operation." She said, "At what time?" He paused. "Around midnight. The horse had arrived at her gate at 3:12. That was 3 hours. The Whiskey Creek drainage was 11 miles from her property by trail. A panicked horse could cover 11 miles of mountain terrain in 3 hours. She ran the math automatically, the way she had run evidence math for 20 years, and the math was consistent. She said, "I may have heard something last night." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. He said, "We'd like to search the property." She said, "Do you have a warrant?" He said, "Mrs. Thorne." He said her name the way people say the names of problems. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're here because county property and county evidence need to be recovered. If you cooperate with us today, and I mean fully, completely, with no delays, I'm in a position to speak with the bank about your mortgage situation. I'm on the board of the Valley Agricultural Credit Association. One phone call from me, and your deferral gets extended another 12 months. No penalty, no lien review." She stood on her porch in the cold and looked down at him. He said, "All I need you to do is sign a voluntary consent form and let us collect what came onto your property without your permission. The horse and anything attached to it. Simple." She could see his men positioning themselves. Not randomly. They were spacing themselves along the fence line in a pattern that had been agreed upon before they arrived. They were covering the exits. "Simple," she said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. He held it out to her. She looked at it. Then she looked at the tree line past his shoulder, the same tree line Daniel had driven toward 3 years ago. She said, "Can I have a few minutes to read it?" He said, "Of course." We're patient people. She took the document from his hand and went back inside. She spread the document on the kitchen table without reading it. She already knew what it said. 20 years of forensic work meant she had seen consent to search forms in every variant, and this one's language would be standard, broad enough to cover anything that had arrived on her property, specific enough to sound like a narrow request. The horse, and anything attached to it. That last phrase was doing all the work. The camera was in the barn. She had not touched it. She had not opened the bag, had not extracted the film, had not done anything that could be construed as tampering with evidence, except that if she signed this form, the camera and its contents would cease to exist in any legally useful sense within the hour. She understood that. She had watched evidence disappear before, in cases where the people controlling the evidence were the same people who needed it to disappear. She went to the window and looked at Sterling Vance's back. He was standing at the foot of her porch steps, facing the barn. Not the house, the barn, as if he already knew. She thought about Daniel, not the abstraction of Daniel, the theoretical missing husband, the open case, the grief that had become so familiar it had stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like weather. She thought about specific Daniel, the way he ground his coffee beans too coarse because he liked the grit of it, the way he read his notes back to himself in a low murmur while he was processing a story, not quite talking, not quite silent, the way he had pressed his forehead against hers on the porch the last morning she had seen him and said, without explanation, that he was sorry for all the weekends he had worked when he should have been present. She had told him not to be dramatic. She had been trying to be light about it because she had been afraid. She turned from the window and opened the cabinet above the refrigerator, where she kept the supplies for the darkroom when she was restocking from the main house. Developer. Stop bath. Fixer. She checked the fixer bottle. It was low. Maybe enough. Maybe not enough. The question was whether she had enough reserve in the darkroom tanks downstairs to complete a full development sequence on a 36 exposure roll. 24 frames, the counter had read. She ran the timeline in her mind. The development process for 35mm black and white film. She assumed black and white. Daniel had always worked in black and white for documentary work. Took approximately 22 minutes for development. 1 minute stop bath, 8 minutes fixer, then wash and dry. 35 minutes minimum, working fast, 45 being honest. She heard boots on the porch steps. Not Vance's measured tread. Someone else, someone moving quickly, and then a knock on the door that was less a request and more an announcement. She opened it. The man on the other side was young, maybe 28, with the particular blankness of someone who had learned to keep his face professional while his body stayed ready. He wore a canvas jacket like the others, no insignia. He said, without preamble, Inspector Vance would like to know if you've had time to review the consent form. She said, I'm reviewing it. He said, he says to tell you the county medical examiner has been notified of a potential evidence situation. If the property search proceeds without consent, the process gets significantly more formal. She understood the threat. The medical examiner was a detail chosen to apply a specific kind of pressure. The suggestion that what had come onto her property was connected to something that produced a body. Or bodies. She said, tell him I'll be out in 5 minutes. She closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked up the consent form, folded it carefully, and put it in her jacket pocket. She took the flashlight from the counter. She walked through the house, down the interior stairs, through the laundry room, and into the converted basement that held the darkroom. She unlocked the darkroom door with the key she kept on a cord around her neck. Inside, the familiar smell of chemistry and sealed air. 2 enlargers she no longer used. The light-tight film-changing bag, folded on the shelf. The developer tanks, 3 of them, stainless steel, clean and waiting. The chemistry bottles, arranged by process order the way she had arranged them for 20 years. The safe light, a dark amber bulb that allowed black and white work without fogging the paper. She checked the chemical levels. Developer, full. Stop bath, full. Fixer, low but present. Enough, maybe, if she did not waste any on test strips. She heard the trucks outside. She heard voices, multiple, getting closer to the barn. She went back upstairs, out through the back door, moving fast, but without running. Running attracted attention differently than walking. She crossed the yard to the barn side door, the one that faced away from the trucks. The horse looked up at her when she entered. It had eaten the oats and drunk most of the water and was standing with its head lowered, still tired, but calmer. She spoke to it in the low, continuous voice she had once used to keep herself grounded at crime scenes. Not meaningful speech, just sound, the human equivalent of a heartbeat made audible. She unbuckled the camera bag from the saddle ring and lifted it free. The cracked shell opened easily. Inside, a Nikon FM2 body, black, with Daniel's lens mounted. She recognized the body now. It was not Daniel's original body, which had been a Leica. Someone had transferred the lens. The FM2 was loaded with film. She turned it carefully in her hands, checking the frame counter in the amber light coming through the barn's high window. 24. She pulled the dark slide, an old habit, checking that the lens was properly seated, and her hand stopped. There was something wrong with the lens mount. Not mechanically wrong. There was a series of very fine scratches on the mount ring, the kind produced by repeated forced removal with an improper tool. Someone had taken this lens off and on many times with the wrong kind of spanner, someone who did not know lenses or did not care. They had been using it, using Daniel's lens, for 3 years, possibly, in rotation with whatever bodies they had available. The specific nature of that violation, the casual use of his tools, his precise and beloved tools, by the people who had made him disappear, produced in Myra a sensation she had no clean name for. It was past anger. It was past grief. It was the particular cold clarity that arrives when the situation finally becomes completely, irreversibly understood. She pressed the rewind button on the FM2's base and began to rewind the film. Outside, she heard Sterling Vance's voice, close now, speaking to someone at the barn door. He said, "Check inside." She was already moving. She released the film canister into her palm. The rewind had taken 12 seconds, faster than it should have been, the spool loose from whatever had happened to it during the horse's run, and she slipped it into her jacket pocket and set the empty camera back into the cracked bag and buckled the bag back to the saddle ring. The barn side door was 7 feet away. She reached it 2 seconds before she heard the main barn door begin to roll open on its track. She did not run across the yard. She walked, her back to the barn, the film canister pressing against her palm inside her pocket. She went through the back door of the house, through the laundry room, and down the stairs to the darkroom. She locked the door from the inside. In the dark, she stood with her back against the door and her hand around the canister and waited for her heart rate to stabilize. Then she flicked on the safe light. The darkroom glowed amber. Everything was familiar. Everything was in its place. The developing tanks, the chemistry bottles, the changing bag folded on the shelf. She needed to load the film into the developing tank in complete darkness. She put the canister and a reel and the tank body into the changing bag, slid her hands in through the light-tight sleeve, and sealed it. In the dark inside the bag, she worked by touch alone, prying the canister open with the bottle opener she always kept in the changing bag, threading the film onto the reel by feel. She had done this hundreds of times. The film threaded correctly on the second try. She dropped the loaded reel into the tank, seated the lid, sealed it. She pulled her hands out of the bag. She poured the developer through the tank's light trap opening, started the timer on her watch, and began the inversion sequence, turning the tank end over end in a slow, regular rhythm to ensure even development. Her hands were steady. She watched the second hand on her watch and turned the tank and listened to what was happening upstairs. Boots on the floor above. More than one set. Vance's men were inside the house. She kept inverting the tank. After 4 minutes, footsteps reached the laundry room above her. She heard the interior basement door rattle. It was solid oak, original to the house, hung on 3 heavy hinges, and the lock was a deadbolt she had installed herself with a 4-inch strike plate because she had always needed the darkroom to be genuinely light-tight and not just approximately light-tight. Someone knocked. She kept inverting the tank. A different voice from Vance's, younger, rougher at the edges, said, "Mrs. Thorne, we need you to open this door." She said, "I'm in the middle of a chemical process. Interrupting it will ruin a month of archival work." Silence. Then, "Inspector says to open it," she said. "If you open this door before I tell you it's safe, you'll expose photographic paper I've been processing for 4 weeks. That's destruction of historical property. The County Historic Preservation Covenant specifically." She let the sentence dangle. Silence from above. She kept her eyes on the watch. The developer was at 18 minutes. The film was, likely, a standard 400 ISO black and white stock, which meant the development time at 68 degrees would be 11 minutes at most. She had been running it for 9. She poured the developer out through the light trap opening, poured the stop bath in, agitated for 60 seconds, poured it out, reached for the fixer. The fixer bottle was lighter than she had hoped. She poured everything that was in it into the tank. She started counting. At minimum, the film needed 8 minutes in fixer to be stable and light. She tilted the bottle against the light. Enough for 8 minutes if she was lucky. She would find out if she was lucky. Upstairs, she heard Vance's own voice now, closer. He had come inside. She heard him say something she could not make out, and then the other voice said, clearly, "She says she's processing historical photographs, and it's a preservation issue." A pause. Then Vance said, also clearly, "Tell her she has 5 minutes." She kept counting. At 8 minutes, she poured the fixer out. She poured water through the tank to begin the wash. 2 changes, 30 seconds each. Not ideal, but functional. Then she opened the tank. The film came off the reel in a strip that she held up against the amber safe light. The images were there. She could not read them well in the amber light. They were negatives, reversed in tone, and the safe light was designed for paper, not film. But she could see that frames were populated. Forms, shapes, trees, and, in several frames, the unmistakable shape of human figures. And in one frame near the end of the roll, a shape that was not trees and not figures, but something lower to the ground, something that the negative tone suggested was pale in reality, very pale, in a dark hollow. She needed paper prints to see what she was actually seeing. The voice at the door said, "Mrs. Thorne, time." She clipped the film strip to the drying line above the sink and turned to the enlarger. The sound of an engine changed everything. Not the truck engines, those she had been tracking as background since dawn. This was different. A higher, mechanical groan that built over several seconds and then became a crash that shook dust from the ceiling of the darkroom. They had used one of the trucks to push open the main gate. The wooden gate posts were set in concrete, but the gate itself was iron pipe construction. She had replaced it herself 5 years ago, welding the frame from salvaged fence material. It could not hold against 2 tons of diesel pickup at any speed. She felt the impact through the stone foundation of the house. Then another sound, closer, the back door glass breaking. They had come around. She pulled the exposed film strip from the drying line. It was not fully dry. It would be tacky and vulnerable, but dry enough to handle without destroying it, and rolled it carefully around 2 fingers, placed it in the small aluminum canister from the shelf, sealed the canister. She put the canister in the interior chest pocket of her flannel jacket, under the outer jacket, against her sternum. Then she turned to the enlarger. She did not have time for proper prints. The full process of enlarging, exposing, developing, and fixing prints would take another 40 minutes minimum. But she had one option that was faster. Contact prints. She pulled a sheet of variable contrast photographic paper from the box in the light-tight drawer. She laid the film strip directly on top of it, emulsion side down. She needed 8 to 12 seconds of white light exposure to make a contact print. She had the white light source. She had the paper. She could do this in under 2 minutes. She heard the laundry room door above her. Not the deadbolt, the hinges. They were taking the door off its hinges. She pressed the negative strip firmly against the paper and reached up to the enlarger's white light switch. She had used this enlarger for 15 years. The switch was a rotary dial on the left side, set to a specific position for white light exposure. She turned it. 8 seconds. She turned it back. She moved the paper to the developer tray, sloshing the chemical over it, beginning the clock. Above her, the door came free of its hinges with a splitting sound and a rush of cold air from the laundry room. Footsteps on the stairs. More than one set. The image began to appear on the paper in the developer tray. She watched it come in. It was a contact sheet, all 24 frames printed together, small, but legible. She could see trees. She could see men, at least 4 distinct figures across several frames. She could see what appeared to be equipment, industrial containers, possibly, large and cylindrical, in a clearing. She could see coordinates scratched into the mud in front of the containers in one frame, visible because the photographer had positioned himself low to the ground to catch the light at the right angle. She could see Sterling Vance. His face was turned toward the photographer in 3 frames, not looking directly at the lens, but close enough. And in the frame near the end of the roll, the frame with the pale shape in the dark hollow, she could see, with the chemicals still developing the image fully, the outline of what had been left there. The developer tray was 10 inches from her face. She did not look away. She knew what she was looking at. She had spent 20 years looking at exactly this kind of photograph. She let herself know it fully, for one complete breath, and then she moved it to the stop bath, and then the fixer, and then she picked it up. The door at the top of the stairs burst open. 3 men came down the stairs with flashlights and rifles in the carry position, and they found Myra Thorne standing in a fully lit darkroom. She had turned on the overhead fluorescent when the contact print was fixed, because there was no longer anything to protect from light, holding a damp sheet of photographic paper in both hands. The first man said, "Set that down." She said, "No." He said it again. She said, "The number on my phone screen right now is the FBI field office in Medford. I started dialing before you broke my door down. If I don't add the last digit in the next 30 seconds, it connects automatically." She held up the phone in her left hand. The screen showed a number half entered. This was not entirely true. The phone was real. The number was partly right. The auto-connect feature was something she had set up in the previous 20 minutes while the fixer was working, using a callback app she had downloaded years ago for exactly this kind of situation, a dead man's switch. Essentially, that would complete a stored dial if she did not actively cancel it. The first man looked at the other 2 men. She said, 30 seconds from when I showed you the phone." She could hear Sterling Vance at the top of the stairs. She could hear him speaking in a careful, measured tone, keeping his voice moderated, the way men keep their voices when they are trying to control a situation that is starting to become uncontrollable. He said, from the top of the stairs, "Mrs. Thorne, let's not do something we can't walk back from." She said, "I passed that point about 3 years ago, Inspector." 18 seconds on the app. He came down the stairs. He stood at the bottom and looked at the contact sheet in her hands, and then at her face, and she watched him make the calculation she had been waiting for him to make. The calculation between what he could do right now, in this basement, with these men, and what the consequences of that would be, and whether the consequences were acceptable given what she already had in her hands. She watched him decide. He said, "Cut the line." She kept her eyes on him. 14 seconds. He said, "We'll get a warrant. This will all be properly processed." She said, "Through your department? Through your county judge?" He said nothing. She said, "I'd like you to leave my property." He looked at the contact sheet one more time. Then he said, to the men around her, "Outside." Now, they did not leave. That was the first thing she confirmed when she climbed to the first floor and looked through the windows. The trucks were still there, repositioned, 2 at the front gate, 2 along the south fence, 2 at the edge of the access road. A slow encirclement, methodical, the kind of pressure that didn't require action to be effective, just presence. Just the ongoing fact of armed men outside a woman's house in the valley fog. Sterling Vance stood on her porch. He had not moved to leave. He was standing with his arms crossed and his hat down against the wind, and when she appeared at the window, he looked at her without expression. She stepped back from the window. Her hands were still damp from the darkroom. She pressed them against her jeans and looked at the room around her. The kitchen she had been in 10,000 times. The table where she and Daniel had eaten 10,000 meals. The window through which she had looked at the tree line every morning for 3 years, hoping and not hoping for movement. She thought about the contact sheet. She had memorized it in the 60 seconds she'd had before coming upstairs, the way she had memorized evidence for 2 decades, not trying to remember, just letting the image fix itself behind her eyes. The 24 frames. The forest clearing with the industrial containers. The coordinates in the mud. The 4 men. Vance's face, turned 3/4 toward the camera, unmistakable. And the last frame. The hollow. The pale shape. She knew what she had seen. She had needed, in the basement, to let herself know it, and she had. And now she needed to carry it without letting it overtake the part of her mind that was still managing the situation, still making decisions, still functioning. This was the thing she had learned in 20 years of forensic work. You could hold grief and function at the same time. Not forever, not without cost, but for the duration of what needed to be done. She also thought about the mortgage. She had not wanted to think about it, had resisted placing it in the same mental space as the contact sheet and the film and the hollow in the forest because the proximity felt obscene. Her financial situation was not a factor in the moral calculus. She knew that, but she was 54 years old and she was alone, and she was 8 months behind on a loan she could not refinance. And if Sterling Vance made one phone call to the Valley Agricultural Credit Association, the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings within 90 days. She would lose the property, the barn, the creek, the dark timber house, the darkroom, the 14 acres. Everything that was left of what had been theirs. The horse was in the barn. The horse was alive and frightened and temporary. If Vance's men found it and took it, they would take it somewhere she would never find it, and whatever additional evidence it might represent would disappear. But the horse was not the evidence. The film was the evidence. The contact print was the evidence. She had both. She sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at the grain of the wood. Daniel would have told her to go to the FBI immediately. He had covered federal law enforcement for 11 years. He understood jurisdictional boundaries better than most lawyers. He would have said that the only safe play was to remove herself from Jackson County jurisdiction as fast as possible, because Sterling Vance controlled the county machinery and could use it in ways that would be difficult to undo. False obstruction charges, evidence suppression, a public narrative that would take months to counter even if ultimately disproven. He would have been right, but he would also have recognized something she was recognizing now. She did not have a clean exit. 2 trucks at the front gate, 1 on the access road. The back of the property bordered the federal wilderness boundary, and beyond that boundary were 11 miles of roadless mountain terrain before the next paved surface. She could walk it. She had walked it before, in summer, with equipment. In November, in the dark, in fog, it was a different proposition. Unless she was not walking. She thought about the horse. The gray Lusitano was in the barn. It was exhausted, but it had eaten and drunk and had 4 hours of rest. It was a large, well-trained animal of a breed historically used for difficult mountain work in Portugal's Serra da Estrela. It had come 11 miles through backcountry terrain in the dark in a state of distress. Rested and directed by a rider who knew the terrain, it could cover the 6 miles to the county boundary and the state route beyond in under an hour. From the state route, she could flag a vehicle or reach her phone with enough signal to make a call. She went back to the window. Vance had not moved. The men at the fence were moving slowly along the perimeter, not aggressively, just present. She watched the south fence line for 30 seconds, timing the gaps between the 2 men walking there. 45 seconds between passes. The south fence terminated at the back pasture, which was hedged by a dense line of Douglas fir. If she could get to the back pasture without being seen from the south, the tree line would cover her to the barn. She went to the laundry room and looked at the back door. The glass was broken. Cold air came through the frame. She could see the yard. No one on the east side of the house. She had 8 seconds, maybe, between the moment she stepped out and the moment someone on the south fence could angle around the house corner and see her. She took the contact sheet from the counter where she'd set it and folded it carefully inside a waterproof map envelope from the utility drawer. She put the envelope flat against her ribs under both jackets, next to the film canister. She put on her wool hat and her riding gloves. She looked at the phone in her hand. The signal indicator showed 1 bar. Intermittent, not enough to make a reliable call or send a file. But her vehicle was in the barn, and her vehicle had a satellite communicator attached to the dash, a precaution she had taken after Daniel disappeared, because she had decided she would not be unreachable the way he had been unreachable. If she could get to the truck, she could send a message. If she could get to the horse, she could get there faster than any of the vehicles blocking her property's exits could follow on the backcountry terrain. She thought about Daniel on the porch that last morning, the apology he had offered for all the weekends he had worked. She thought about what she had said in response. "Don't be dramatic," said in the voice she used when she was frightened and trying not to show it. She thought, "I should have said I know. I should have said it's all right. I should have said 100 things, and now the only thing left is this." She opened the back door. She crossed the yard in 7 seconds, low and fast along the fence line, using the tool shed as a break between herself and the south fence. She reached the barn's rear wall without being called to and pressed her back against the cold timber for a 3 count. Then she slipped through the side door. The horse was standing. It turned to look at her, and she spoke to it in the low voice again, moving immediately to the tack wall for a bridle. The saddle was still on. Vance's men had checked the barn but had not unsaddled the animal, either because they had not thought to or because they had been called away before finishing. She would use the saddle. No time for anything else. She checked the barn doors. The main door was closed but not locked. She could hear, outside, a vehicle engine running. One of the trucks had moved closer. She had a 3-minute window, possibly less. She thought about the flashes. The darkroom's emergency circuit. She had installed it 12 years ago for exactly the reason it was named. A power failure during a critical development process could ruin irreplaceable archival material. So she had wired a backup circuit to the barn's original electrical panel, which ran off a separate breaker than the house. Attached to that circuit were the old studio strobes, two Sunpack industrial flash units she had bought used in the 90s for forensic scene work, each capable of putting out 800 watt-seconds of light. The strobes were in the darkroom, connected to the barn panel through a cable she ran under the house when she converted the basement. She thought, if the men come through the basement door? She crossed to the barn's interior utility box and opened it. The circuit panel showed the emergency line connected. She looked at the trigger switch on the wall, a manual push, the kind you push to confirm the backup circuit was live. She would not be here when they came through the door, but she needed them not to be here for as long as possible. She set the strobe trigger on a 45-second delay, using the timer mechanism she had added to the circuit for automated exposure sequences, and pressed arm. Then she put on the bridle, checked the girth, took a breath, and swung herself onto the horse. She had ridden competently once. Not in years. She sat the horse and felt it adjust beneath her. Not the adjustment of a horse that needed management, but the adjustment of an animal remembering what it was for. She guided it to the rear of the barn, to the loading door that faced the back pasture. The loading door was on a sliding track. She leaned down and pulled the pin, and it rolled open, and the fog and the cold morning air came in. She kicked the horse forward. It went, without hesitation, without the resistance of a horse unsure of its footing, the sure-footed absolute commitment of a well-trained animal responding to a clear signal. They came out of the barn into the fog at a canter that became a gallop within 4 strides, heading south and east toward the Douglas fir line. Behind her, 25 seconds later, she heard shouting from the direction of the basement. Then the strobes went off. She did not see them directly. She was already in the tree line, but the fog lit up behind her in a rapid white sequence, a hammering strobe of 800 watt-second industrial light that in a dark enclosed space would have produced a temporary blindness lasting 30 to 90 seconds, depending on the darkness adaptation of the eyes involved. She had experienced it herself during a training exercise 20 years ago. It was not subtle. She heard a truck engine accelerate, then stop, someone hitting the south fence, possibly, unable to navigate in the strobe's aftermath. She heard a shout that became 2 shouts. She and the horse were in the trees. The Douglas fir closed around them like a held breath. The fog was thicker here, and darker, and the horse moved through it on instinct, its feet finding the ground that the fog obscured. She kept her hands light on the reins and let it choose its path. It seemed to know the terrain better than she did, or perhaps simply better than fear. She rode. The first mile was the worst. The terrain above the back pasture rose steeply into boulder country. Sitka spruce giving way to open rock faces where the horse had to pick across talus at a pace that felt criminally slow against the sound of engines she could still hear below. She did not look back. Looking back changed your balance on a horse. She kept her eyes on the fog ahead and trusted the animal's footwork. She heard, at some point in the second mile, a vehicle on what must have been the Forest Service road that paralleled the wilderness boundary. Someone was trying to flank her, cutting north on the road network to intercept. She altered course without deciding to, the horse responding to a shift in her weight that she had not consciously made. The fir stands deepened and the vehicle sound faded. Her hands were cold through the riding gloves. The contact sheet and the film canister were pressed against her ribs, and she was aware of them the way she was aware of her own heartbeat, not constantly, but in the way that the important things make themselves known. She was 3 miles from the state route. The horse was breathing hard but maintaining. Its coat was wet again, this time from exertion rather than fear, which was a different quality of wetness. She spoke to it occasionally, not instructions, just acknowledgement. "You're doing it. We're going. It's all right." The fog was lightening now, not dissipating, just changing quality, the way fog does when the sun behind it is getting higher, turning from opaque white to a luminous gray that played tricks with distance and direction. She found the fire lookout trail by accident, recognizing it from the shape of a boulder she had walked past in the summer. The trail ran southeast, switchbacking down toward the valley floor, and at the valley floor it met the county road that connected to the state route at the Shady Cove intersection. She pressed the horse downward. Behind her, she heard nothing now. Either the pursuit had given up or they had not found the fire trail. Either way, she had distance, and distance was what she had needed. At the bottom of the switchback, where the trail leveled into the creek bottom, She let the horse slow to a walk and pulled the satellite communicator from the saddle bag, where she had found it hanging from the saddle ring. She had packed it herself 3 months ago under the seat of her truck, and it had migrated to the barn tack room. She had attached it to the saddle on some restless late-night impulse she did not remember now, but was grateful for. She powered it on. The satellite communicator connected in 40 seconds, slow, sluggish, the cold affecting the battery, and she composed a message in the small text window that the device provided. She addressed it to a specific email account, the FBI field office in Medford, which maintained a public contact email for tip submissions that she had found 3 years ago and never used. The message was 61 words. It named Sterling Vance. It named the location of the industrial containers in the forest clearing. She had the coordinates from the contact print, memorized from the mud in frame 18. It said she was coming in with photographic evidence of multiple federal crimes and that her life was in danger from local law enforcement. She pressed send. Then she rode the last 2 miles to the state route. She had not thought about the first frame on the roll. She had been so focused on the evidence frames, the containers, the coordinates, the faces, that she had moved quickly past the beginning of the contact print, where the first frame sat. She had noticed it was different from the others. Not a scene shot. Something smaller, closer to the lens. It was only now, sitting on the horse at the edge of the state route in the gray morning light, waiting for the sound of the federal vehicles her satellite message had promised would be dispatched, that she pulled the contact print from its envelope and looked at it properly. The first frame. The photographer had taken it close, very close, the focal length compressed on whatever subject was in front of the lens. It was dark, badly lit, shot in what appeared to be very low available light, which was why she had initially dismissed it as a technical failure and moved to the legible frames. But it was not a failure. It was a face. A face turned toward the camera, not quite looking at it, caught in a 3/4 profile in low light, the kind of light that came from a single lamp in a small space, maybe a truck cab, maybe a motel room. The face of a person who had set the camera on a surface, put it on timer, and walked back to stand in front of it. She knew every plane of that face. She knew it the way she knew the grain of the kitchen table, the way she knew the sound of coffee grinding too coarse, the way she knew, without having to be told, that the wool hat she was wearing right now was the same wool hat he had bought her the winter they replaced the barn roof, because she kept it in the same drawer she had always kept it in, and she had not bought another. Underneath the face, she was holding the contact sheet at arm's length now in the gray light, squinting, bringing 20 years of reading small prints to bear. There was something written. Not in the photograph. On the photograph. Written on the paper itself, as though the photographer had developed this single frame somewhere, somehow, and written on it before hiding it at the head of a new roll for someone to find. The handwriting was precise and familiar, and she had not seen it in 3 years. It said, for Myra, if the world goes dark, trust the light we left. She sat on the horse on the shoulder of the state route, and the contact sheet trembled in her hands, not from the cold, and she let it tremble, and she did not try to stop it. She had spent 3 years not allowing this, not allowing the not knowing to become anything, because allowing it to become something meant allowing the possibility that the something was permanent. Now she allowed it. The fog around her was silver and still, and somewhere in the firs above the road a bird was moving through branches. She could hear the small percussion of its passage without seeing it. The horse stood beneath her, breathing steady, its warmth rising in the cold air, patient in the way that animals are patient when the human they are carrying has stopped directing them and simply needs to be carried. 3 years of doubt dissolved in 40 seconds. She had not been wrong to stay. She had not been wrong to refuse the voluntary disappearance finding. She had not been wrong to keep the darkroom stocked, to keep the chemicals fresh, to keep the key around her neck. She had not been wrong to open the gate at 3 in the morning for an animal that should not have been there. She folded the contact sheet back into the envelope with the care of a person handling something that will outlast them. She put it back against her ribs. Then she heard the sound of vehicles on the state route, coming from the south. Not black trucks, blue and white, flashing silently in the fog, a federal pattern she recognized before she could see the vehicle markings. She raised one hand. The FBI vehicle stopped 20 feet from her. 2 agents, both in tactical gear, both with their hands visible and their posture calibrated to exactly the tension the situation required. Not aggressive, not casual. Professional in the precise way she had always associated with federal work. the federal work that county law enforcement in rural Oregon tended to view with a specific combination of resentment and fear. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and the particular stillness of someone who had been in difficult situations and learned that stillness was a form of control, got out of the vehicle and walked toward her slowly. She said, "Mrs. Thorne?" Myra said, "Yes." The agent said, "We received your communication. Are you injured?" Myra said, "No." The agent looked at the horse, then at the envelope visible in Myra's jacket, then at her face. She said, "Can you tell me what you have?" And then, from behind them both, a sound that made the second agent's hand move toward his hip, the sound of a truck engine on the state route, coming fast from the north. A black truck, one of Vance's convoy. It pulled to a hard stop 40 feet up the road. Sterling Vance stepped out. He was alone in the truck, or appeared to be. He stood behind the open door for a moment, looking at the federal vehicles, at Myra on the horse, at the agent standing between them. He wore no hat now. He must have lost it somewhere on the morning's operations, and without it he looked reduced somehow, the way structures look reduced when the ornamental parts are removed and what remains is the frame. He looked at Myra. She looked at him. He said, across the distance, "Whatever you think you have, Mrs. Thorne." The female agent turned to face him. She said, with complete calm, "Sir, stay at your vehicle." He said, "That woman is in possession of county evidence." The agent said, "Sir, stay at your vehicle and identify yourself." Something moved across his face. She had been watching his face for 3 years, first in the days after Daniel disappeared, then in the long following silence, then this morning across her porch steps. She knew what his face looked like when he was in control. She knew, now, what it looked like when control was leaving. He got back in the truck. He sat there for a long moment. Then the truck pulled a U-turn and drove north. The female agent watched it go. Then she turned back to Myra and said, "We're going to need everything you have." Myra dismounted and handed over the film canister and the contact print. The fog broke over the Rogue River Valley at 11:17 on the morning of November 15th. It broke the way fog breaks after a long siege, not gradually, but in sections, as if the sky had made a decision and was implementing it from the center outward. The valley floor appeared first, the river visible in segments between the trees, running cold and clear. Then the pasture land, then the ridgeline to the east, and finally the high granite faces above the timber, catching light that had been withheld for weeks. Myra stood in the east pasture of the Thorne property and watched it happen. The federal action had been what she had expected it to be once it was in motion, efficient, parallel, and larger than it appeared from the outside. The field office had coordinated with the state police. The county judge, not the one Sterling Vance had access to, but the federal magistrate in Medford, had issued warrants within 4 hours. The industrial clearing in the forest above Whiskey Creek was sealed as a federal evidence site before noon. The arrest of Sterling Vance had taken place at his home at 10:45 in the morning. She had not been present. The agent who called her with the update said that he had not resisted, which she found she could believe. He had always been the kind of man who understood when the calculation had changed. The members of the Rogue River Hunting Association who had been present at the clearing that night were processed over the following 2 days. Their names were read to her by the federal investigator assigned to her case, and she recognized 3 of them from county board meetings she had attended when fighting the property tax reassessment. They had sat across from her and discussed municipal finance with the practiced ease of men who are certain of their footing. The containment site in the Whiskey Creek drainage held 17 years of illegal chemical waste disposal, chlorinated solvents, heavy metal slurry, the runoff chemistry of a processing operation that had moved through 3 different front companies. The ground contamination extended to the water table. The environmental damage would take, the federal investigator told her, a minimum of 12 years to remediate. She thought about the river, about what had been going into it, about the ranchers downstream who had been chalking up cattle health problems to bad luck for the better part of 2 decades. She thought about the people who had known and the people who had not. The hollow in the forest above the clearing, the pale shape in frame 23 of the contact print, was found by a search team on the morning of November 16th. The location matched the coordinates visible in frame 18. What they recovered there was treated with the care that such things require. The same care she had once applied in her professional life to the evidence of violent endings, and she was grateful that the care existed even when she could not participate in it. They told her what she already knew. She stood in the pasture and let the information settle into the place in her chest where the not knowing had lived for 3 years. It was not relief, exactly. Relief implied that something good had replaced something bad. This was not that. This was the closing of a wound that had been open long enough that part of her had forgotten the wound's edges. She felt the closing more than the closure. The horse was in the pasture with her. The federal agricultural officer who had cataloged the animal, properly registering it as evidence, taking photographs, documenting the serial numbers of the saddle hardware, had told her, the second morning, that the registered owner was a man now in federal custody, and that once the case cleared its preliminary processing, the disposition of the horse would be determined by the court. He had said this with the particular careful neutrality of someone who is also saying something else. She had looked at him. He had said, horses are often transferred to caretaker status during extended proceedings to avoid the cost of boarding. She had said, I have a barn. He had said, I'll note that in the file. The gray horse moved through the pasture with the particular ease of an animal that has arrived somewhere and recognized it. She watched it from the fence line, its coat clean now, dried out, returned to the pale silver that was its actual color in good light rather than the dark mud-soaked gray it had been at 3 in the morning at her gate. She thought about that moment, the gate opening, the horse walking through. She thought about all the moments that had led to it, 17 years of illegal chemistry in a hillside hollow. A journalist who had found the thread and followed it somewhere he could not return from alone. 3 rolls of film sent through the mail as a just-in-case. A riderless horse in the dark carrying the evidence of its rider's crimes. And she thought about the first frame. Daniel's face in low light, turned toward the camera he had set on timer, the light around him the intimate light of a small enclosed space. The 7 words he had written on the print. If the world goes dark, trust the light we left. He had known, when he hid that frame at the head of a fresh roll, that whoever found it would have to develop it in darkness. That the only way to the image was through the process, through the chemistry, through the time, through the precise and patient work of making the invisible visible. He had built the message into the medium. He had trusted the method as much as he had trusted her. She walked across the pasture toward the horse. It turned toward her when she was 20 feet away and held still, watching her approach with the alert, receptive stillness of an animal that has already decided about a person and is simply waiting for the person to catch up to the decision. She stopped beside it and put her hand flat on its neck, feeling the warmth of it, the living solidity, the enormous quiet competence of the thing. It breathed steadily. She stood there for a long time in the broken fog, in the sun that was finally reaching the valley floor, in the silence that was not empty but full of river sound and wind in the high pines and the distant sound of traffic on the state route, the regular commerce of a world that continued without caring whether any particular thing within it was resolved. But this thing was resolved, not cleanly. It would not be clean for a long time, possibly not ever in the way people meant when they used the word clean. There would be testimony. There would be the witness of her own photographs, her own evidence, her own 20 years of professional precision turned toward the case that was most personal to her. There would be the days when the weight of what she knew pressed harder than usual, and there would be the days when it pressed less. But she was no longer waiting. She had spent 3 years in the attitude of waiting. The body prepared for information that did not come, the mind running the same calculations on insufficient data, the spirit held in the amber of unresolved grief. She had maintained herself well in that amber. She had worked, she had kept the property, she had kept the darkroom stocked and the key around her neck, and it had been enough. The preservation of her readiness had been enough. The fog was gone. The Rogue River Valley was wide and green and cold and lit by November sun that came at a low angle from the southeast and made long shadows of everything. The fence posts, the barn, the pines on the ridge, the horse beside her, herself, all of them casting long, clean shadows on the grass. She patted the horse once on the neck and began walking back toward the house. The darkroom key pressed against her sternum with every step. She was already thinking about what she would print first. Here is what I want you to take from this story. Myra did not have a weapon. She did not have an army. She did not have money or connections or the institutional power that Sterling Vance had spent a career accumulating. She had her hands, her knowledge, her refusal, and a horse she chose to let in from the dark. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes readiness, preserved through long years of quiet patience, becomes exactly what the moment requires. If this story stayed with you, if you were in that darkroom with her, if you held your breath when the strobes went off, if you felt what she felt when the first frame came into focus, then this channel is where you belong. Hit the like button right now. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Drop your city in the comments and tell me, what would you have done with that film? Would you have handed it over and saved the ranch? Or would you have gone into the dark and trusted the chemistry? Because every story we tell here is built on exactly that question. What do you do when the cost of the truth is everything you have left? Come back next time. There is always another gate to open.